Welcome to Autism and Asperger's Syndrome. Please adjust your speakers and advance to the next slide. For many years, autism and Asperger's syndrome were a part of a group of disorders known as autism spectrum disorders. Recently, Asperger's syndrome has been removed from this group. Currently, there are no medications designed specifically to treat autism and Asperger's syndrome. Some are, however, in the process of being developed. Sometimes medications are prescribed for conditions that occur concurrently or comorbidly with autism or Asperger's syndrome. Vaccines do not cause autism. Vaccine preservatives do not cause autism. There is some risk with any vaccine. However, autism is not one of those risks. There are a number of so-called treatments for autism. However, none of these on this slide have been proven scientifically, and some of them are dangerous. Chelation was originally introduced in the 1920s as a treatment for arsenic gas exposure. Currently, it is used as a treatment for lead poisoning. However, using chelation as a treatment for autism is dangerous and has resulted in the deaths of several children. There are a number of highly successful people who have autism. Dr. Temple Grandin is a university professor in Colorado. Stephen Wiltshire is an artist in Great Britain, and Taylor Crow is an artist in the United States. Jot these names down and Google them, and you can find out more information about their lives and their careers. Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen is an internationally known autism researcher. He has said that autism is an extreme form of the male brain. And here is some very interesting information from Dr. Baron-Cohen's research. So what's it like to have autism? Imagine for a moment the worst sunburn you've ever had. Every touch is excruciatingly painful. And it itches too. You've just got to scratch that itch. But when you do, and even though you have this incredibly painful, itchy sunburn, you also have to wear uncomfortable, tight-fitting clothing made out of burlap. Along with the sunburn and the ill-fitting burlap clothes, imagine you are wearing headphones. There's music playing on your headphones. The kind of music you absolutely hate. And the headphone volume is as high as it can go. So with your sunburn, your burlap clothes, and unbelievably loud music in your headphones, your teacher is asking you to write a paragraph on the Civil War. Since you're really bright and you know all about the Civil War, you decide to tell her about it rather than write. Given your sunburn and your burlap clothes and your headphones and the music you hate turned up really high, what other behaviors might you engage in? So back to my original question. How does it feel to have autism? Dr. Leo Kanner was the first researcher in the 1940s to use the term autism to describe the constellation of symptoms. In his initial study, he stated that the parents of these children are cold, humorless perfectionists. Unfortunately, that got translated into people blaming parents for children having autism and the rise of the phrase refrigerator moms. All of that is not true. What is true is that autism has a genetic component. As many as 20 different chromosomes may be involved, and having one child with autism means you have a 5% or 1 in 20 chance of having another child with autism. Boys are diagnosed with autism 10 times as often as girls. We also know that autism is brain-based. There are disruptions of brain development while the child is in utero, and infant brain growth patterns are different from normally developing children. We also know that autism often occurs with other conditions. For example, a third of children with autism spectrum disorders also develop epilepsy in their lifetimes. For many years, scientists believed that most individuals with autism had below average intelligence. However, since intelligence is measured using language, scientists are working on new, non-language based ways of measuring intelligence, and these figures may not be accurate anymore. There is a saying in the world of autism: if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. What that means is there is no such thing as a typical child with autism. However, there are three major behaviors that accompany children with autism diagnosis. Number one is impaired social interactions. Number two, impaired communication skills. And number three, repetitive stereotyped patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. In addition to the big three just discussed, there are other behaviors that may be seen in individuals with autism spectrum disorders. They may have abnormal responses to stimuli. They may have no response to emotions in other people. They may be overly or underly sensitive. They lack variety and spontaneity in play and in their interpersonal communications. They can be preoccupied with parts of objects, and they engage in a behavior called stimming, where they will flap their arms or fingers to self-stimulate. When a physician is considering a diagnosis of autism, there are certain triggers that are looked for. One is no babbling or finger pointing at 12 months of age. Another is no sharing of interest in objects with others. No single words by 16 months of age. No two-word phrases by 24 months of age, and any loss of language and/or social skills at any age. Specifically in the classroom, you may see these types of behaviors from children with autism spectrum disorders: inappropriate laughing or giggling, seeming no fear of danger, an insensitivity to pain. They don't like to cuddle. They tend to have uneven physical and/or verbal skills. They often sustain an unusual, repetitive play. They avoid eye contact and prefer to be alone. They tend to have great difficulty expressing their needs and sometimes develop inappropriate attachments to objects. Children with autism spectrum disorders in the classroom insist on things being the same. Sometimes they will echo words or phrases. They may spin themselves or objects and have inappropriate responses to sounds. So what works for children with autism spectrum disorders? First of all, highly structured, intensive, skill-oriented training is needed. In addition, that training needs to start as early as possible in the child's life. Also, medications may be used to control symptoms of other conditions that go along with autism, such as depression or epilepsy. This is Dr. Hans Asperger. He first discovered and postulated the idea of what we now know as Asperger's syndrome in the 1940s, but medical literature really did not popularize it until the 1990s. So what is Asperger's syndrome? While it shares many symptoms with autism, there are some dramatic differences. Probably the biggest one is the fact that there are no delays in their language. However, it's important to keep in mind that individuals with Asperger's syndrome often use language not to communicate, but to gratify. Here's what I mean by that. If you ask a person with Asperger's syndrome a yes or no question, they have a 50% chance of being right and making you go away. There are some other symptoms that are different from autism in Asperger's syndrome individuals. In addition to no language delays, they tend to be of average or above average intelligence and have no delays in their self-help or adaptive skills. They tend to be able to focus on preferred activities for extended periods of time. However, they can become extremely frustrated and agitated when routines are changed without warning. Individuals with Asperger's syndrome have great difficulty reading body language, gestures, facial expressions, and voice tone, and will literally interpret whatever you say. If you tell a person with Asperger's syndrome, "I went to Vegas and lost my shirt," this child might actually take off his shirt and give it to you. Individuals with Asperger's syndrome also have great difficulty with vagueness, approximation, and ambiguity, and they tend to be very egocentric. They will also follow classroom rules to the letter. Because individuals with Asperger's syndrome tend to have average to above average intelligence, they may sometimes appear to be deliberately engaging in antisocial behavior. However, this is rarely the case in individuals with Asperger's syndrome. So, what do students with Asperger's syndrome need? First, they need to develop communication skills, the ability to make their needs and wants known in a socially acceptable manner. You need to avoid sarcasm, idioms, and figures of speech because these confuse individuals with Asperger's syndrome. You also need to use an even, non-emotional tone of voice because the expression of emotion can also cause confusion. Don't demand eye contact. Sometimes looking away or looking down will mean that the student is concentrating on what you are saying. Forcing eye contact can actually break the concentration of the student with Asperger's syndrome. And finally, don't accept yes or no answers. Probe for deeper understanding. Here are some examples of idioms that you should avoid using with individuals with Asperger's syndrome. I'm sure you can think of many more. The second thing that students with Asperger's syndrome need are social skills. Teachers and other adults in the classroom must model pro-social behaviors. Students with Asperger's syndrome require direct, explicit instruction in things like social skills. Classroom rules must be clearly posted and referred to often, and it helps if the rules have visual components. And finally, if the student with Asperger's syndrome begins exhibiting what we would normally call emotional or manipulative behaviors, this is usually a sign of increased agitation and stress. Another thing that students with Asperger's syndrome need is the proper kind of instruction. As mentioned before, direct instruction is essential because students with Asperger's syndrome need routine and predictability throughout their day. You also need to provide a rationale for the instruction so they can understand the cause and effect. You may need to use external organizers, especially graphic organizers, and remember this. Students with Asperger's syndrome do not do well with surprises. Any changes in routine require explicit preparation before the change takes place. Here are some additional suggestions for use in a classroom with children with Asperger's syndrome and autism. In the area of social interactions, you need to be aware of the personal space needs of the individuals. You might want to develop groups of children in which autistic students can contribute. You also need to monitor for provocation because sometimes other students will bully individuals with autism spectrum disorders. You can use preferred seating. You can teach the other students in your class about autism spectrum disorders. Set up opportunities for them to practice social interactions with a peer and designate a minimum number of social exchanges in which the child needs to participate. And it's also a good idea to teach the appropriate use of toys. In the area of communication, it's always a good idea to present material visually. That means you can use objects, pictures, hands-on demonstrations to help teach these students. You will also need to specifically teach the skills that they are lacking through the use of social stories and role-playing. And finally, it's always a good idea to use planted questions to help encourage them to participate. Finally, in the area of classroom behaviors, don't ask children with autism or Asperger's syndrome to be good because they don't know what that means. You should provide them a visual schedule in a very usable form. Try to avoid clutter and surprises. You might even want to set up a buddy system. When you reinforce these students, make sure that reinforcement is immediate, concrete, and individualized to the student. Finally, consistent, predictable routines and a comfortable learning environment are very important. Finally, it's important to treat all students with dignity and respect. It's important to learn about the disability, but it's more important that you learn about the child, because teaching children with special needs makes us better teachers, and it also makes us better human beings. If you would like more information about this or other topics, please contact me.